how can you put suppliers at the core of your business? Christian Schuh is Senior Partner and Managing Director of Boston Consulting Group. Hello, Christian.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining me. So BCG, Boston Consulting Group, has a new publication, I believe, called Profit from the Source, Transforming Your Business by Putting Suppliers at the Core. The authors are you, Wolfgang Schnellbecker, Alenka Triplett, and Daniel Weise.
Correct.
Sounds like an interesting publication. So that being the case, help me understand, how can CEOs put suppliers at the core of their business?
Well, there's an incredible discrepancy, Bob. So companies spend at least 50% of the budget on suppliers, often a lot more, like 60 or 70%. Yet according to recent research from Harvard Business School, CEOs on average just spend 7 minutes per day on suppliers, and that can't be right?
No,
so
that's amazing.
it cannot be right for all the risks lurking out there in the supply chain. I'm sure we're going to talk about, and it also cannot be right for all the rewards to be harvested, right? So definitely not right doing it this way.
Well, CEOs themselves may not even have visibility of who those suppliers are. I mean, they put that on they put that burden on the shoulders of their procurement people, and so they've got other things to worry about. But you're arguing here that should not be the case; that they should have active knowledge of and direct relationship with those suppliers. Right? Okay. Yeah. Well, but put them at the core, though. I mean, that's an interesting way of putting it. I mean, acknowledging who they are is one thing. But what should a CEO actually be doing in order to ensure that the suppliers that they have this type relationship with them?
Well, I think CEOs should at least spend 20-25% of the time with the suppliers that matter, right? And now we could have a long discussion about which suppliers matter, right? And do you want me to go into that?
Well, it sounds like we're talking about the old 80-20 rule, aren't we? Where 20% of the suppliers responsible for 80% of the not so much, or what do you mean by that?
Not necessarily, right? So of course the 80-20 rule would apply to your current big suppliers, right? But the problem is that companies are just looking typically at tier 1 suppliers, so the direct suppliers, but they're mostly ignoring what's happening in the second and third tier of the supply chain.
I see.
And for example, if you look into the semiconductor crisis that the automotive industry is experiencing, but also other industries, the problem is that the car makers had outsourced the responsibility for semiconductor suppliers to the tier 1 suppliers. So when the crisis hit, they had no idea who these suppliers are. They had zero relationship. And in the end, then CEOs, and now coming back to your question, CEOs of these companies found themselves in a super uncomfortable position. They were like beggars with head in hand, asking for parts, right? And you don't want to be in that type of situation.
And if they had done something differently beforehand, I mean, this microprocessor shortage is global.
Yeah.
Could they have alleviated or mitigated the situation by doing something differently beforehand?
Yeah, definitely. So I think CEOs should have, and it's not too late, it's never too late, should understand which suppliers are important in the first tier, second tier, third tier, right? And then I believe they need to build a relationship to their counterparts at these companies. And in the end, this is a competition, a battle for mindshare. So you want the executives at your suppliers spend more time thinking about you than they're thinking about your competitors.
So on one hand, it's very important to have that level of supplier loyalty so that when things go bad, that supplier is on your side and you can turn to them for supply. On the other hand, we hear about the risk of concentrating too much on single suppliers and that you need to diversify your supplier base. Are those two contradictory concepts? How do you do both at the same time?
Well, I think you can have exclusive relationships when it is very, very meaningful for both parties. So look at Apple, right? So Apple is super dependent on TSMC for their chips, the chips they have in the iPhone and in the Mac, right? And this is a mutually exclusive relationship, but it is good for TSMC. So it allows TSMC to invest $30 to $40 billion in capex every year. And it ensures that Apple gets this cutting edge semiconductors at the scale they need, right? But of course, you don't want to have this, or you cannot have this exclusive relationship with everyone, right? So I think for the majority of your suppliers, and now I'm coming back to your 80-20 rule, right? You want to diversify. But it's more than diversifying the names of suppliers, right? So what is concerning is if everything is coming out of one factory. So if you have one supplier, one dominant supplier, but the supplier has a business continuity plan and spreads out the production of the stuff you need across multiple factories, which are ideally on different continents, it's not that concerning, I think.
So geographic diversity is important,
yes.
but you can still have supplier loyalty spread over multiple
Absolutely.
geographies.
Yeah.
Well, that's an excellent point. Now, another concern that has arisen, especially in recent years, is ESG, environmental, social, and governance considerations. How then can you ensure that your suppliers are meeting these requirements for ESG compliance?
Well, I mean, let me maybe talk about carbon emissions as an example, right? I think the problem today is that the carbon emission targets, reduction targets, are very often conflicting to other objectives, other targets you burden on the supplier, right? You expect the supplier to lower cost, and in addition, you expect the supplier in scope 3 upstream to reduce carbon emissions. And that's not good, right? So in the end, you have to work with your supplier at the level of product architecture, right? And this is where engineering comes into play. You have to work with your suppliers to understand, so how can we change, modify the architecture of our products so that the carbon emissions will be reduced at lower cost and in a way that it makes it easier for the suppliers to produce this stuff, right? So I think when we talk about ESG, we should always try to have an alignment of objectives and not a conflict of objectives.
So you need to bring those second tier or third tier suppliers into the product development phase. At the same time, you need to ensure the security of proprietary information. I mean, those suppliers are also supplying other OEMs. So can you do both those things?
You can, but I think the problem is something else, right? Typically, companies don't even know their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, right? So if you remember the Kobe earthquake of 1995, car makers found out the pigments for metallic paint were all coming from the same factory. And the sad thing is that automotive industry, other industries have not really learned much from that, right? So the companies are still very much content with knowing the tier 1 suppliers, and then knowledge about tier 2, tier 3 suppliers becomes very murky, which is a problem in all the supply chain crises we have, but also a problem clearly in ESG.
Okay, so we've been talking about the need to get closer to your so-called priority suppliers, but as we have learned about complex manufacturing supply chains, sometimes the smallest part can bring your entire production to a halt. So how then do you maintain good ties with non-priority suppliers, if indeed any such thing exists these days?
Well, for the smallest part, you don't necessarily need good relationship. What you need is a business continuity plan. Right. So you need to understand, as I said before, is there something hidden in your supply chain where you receive more than 50% of the stuff, and even if it's a tiny component, from one factory, and then you need to raise a red flag, and then you need to go in and say, let's untangle this. You don't need to have a great relationship to the small supplier, but just make sure that one single event incapacitates them.
I see. Once again, the publication from Boston Consulting Group, Profit from the Source, Transforming Your Business by Putting Suppliers at the Core. Christian Schuh of BCG, thank you so much for spending time with me to explain that concept. Vielen Dank.
Thank you, Bob. It was a pleasure.